Hey folks, so today we are going to be talking about synthesizing sources and data. We have been talking and having larger conversations about what research processes can look like. We've talked about the different types of data that we can collect and the different ways that we can go about doing that. So now, what do we do with that data? Once we have conducted our research and we've developed a research question and we've begun to gather our sources, how do we begin to understand what the sources and data are saying? So today we're going to be talking about ways that we can organize our research. We're going to talk about the differences between summary, analysis, and synthesis in preparation for the synthesis matrix. And then we're going to talk about how we can interpret that data. So the first thing I want to talk about is organizing your research. There is no right or wrong way to organize your research, but I want to pose a question to you all. Have you ever had to write a paper where you were required to gather research or sources of some kind to support an argument that you were making? But in the middle of doing all of that, you found yourself jumping around to different open tabs, flipping through pages, or even desperately looking and scanning through articles, looking for a quote that you wanted to use or paraphrase. If you ever found yourself in that situation and you answered yes to any of those, then you probably could have benefited from organizing your research in some capacity prior to writing your paper. And I want to emphasize that is that we can organize our research before we begin writing or composing in any sort of capacity to help us later on. That's not to say that we can't organize after we've begun composing. Things kind of happen out of order, but it's always good to have a good solid organizational basis before we begin composing, because if we try to write while we are still looking through all of our research, that takes more time. And so the efficient way is to plan and organize ahead of time, so it takes less time to actually write or compose the thing that we're trying to do. And like I said, there's so many ways that we can go about doing this. So let's go over a couple of them. First, you could use a bibliography. You all have probably heard this term in some point or another, but I think a lot of times we associate bibliographies with works cited pages, and they're not the same thing. A bibliography is a list of potential sources that you could use, or it is a list of all the sources you have researched over the course of a project or assignment. A works cited page is exactly like it sounds. It is the works you have cited within your paper. So your works cited may only have 10 sources, but in order to get those 10 sources, you may have looked at 30. A works cited page would only have the 10 that you utilized to craft or write your paper, whereas a bibliography is a list of all potential sources or all the sources that you have researched thus far. So two very important distinctions there. And your bibliographies will typically have what I call full citations. There's all different kinds of ways that we can cite our works, but in a works cited or a reference page, you will have the full publication information in that citation. That's why I refer to it as a full citation. And so in bibliographies, these full citations can be in a lot of different formats. They can be in MLA, APA, Chicago, AMA. There's hundreds of citation formats. So whatever assignment it is that you're doing, whatever citation format that assignment requires, and if you have a bibliography, you cite it in that format. Similarly, you have annotated bibliographies. Now, what's the difference between a bibliography and an annotated bibliography? Well, unlike bibliographies, annotated bibs are more than just the citation. A bibliography is the list of the citation information from potential or all sources researched. But an annotated bibliography tries to establish the researcher's credibility and qualifications while also summarizing and evaluating that work. So you provide the full citation and then an annotation of that citation. And it can be really useful to use an annotated bibliography to organize your research, but it can also be utilized as a publication on its own. A lot of scholars will publish annotated bibliographies for other scholars in their field, and it helps other scholars research. And those are what we call reviews, not peer review, just reviews, like reviews of works. These are your more traditional methods. They're similar to, we might see them more linearly, like in outlines, chronological order, alphabetical order. So these are the more traditional methods that we can utilize to organize our research. But there are also visual methods, such as mind maps. We worked on a mind map earlier in the project, and similar to the one that we used to help us brainstorm, these can become more evaluative of the source material, not just our thought processes. So we can brainstorm with the mind map and then maybe build on that mind map to summarize and evaluate each source. We can even provide a spot for us to analyze what those sources mean in relation to a research question. So think of the mind maps that we had to create with our brainstorm. You could take that mind map in theory and you could build on that and provide more context and information if using something in a visual mode is more appropriate for you. And then along those same lines, we have something called a synthesis matrix. What is a synthesis matrix? We're going to be working on one ourselves for DYOP. So unlike bibliographies and annotated bibliographies, but similar to mind maps, it organizes your research by theme, not just by individual source. With mind maps, you may have the broad concept and then a couple of sources that are linked to that. In a synthesis matrix, it functions very similarly, except instead of using a mind map, you're using a spreadsheet. It allows you to visualize how your source may be useful to one or more theme you're recognizing in the research, while also allowing you to see what the gaps in the research are in relation to your specific research question. When I say gaps in the research, that means that maybe there's something that is not being addressed in the research you've conducted, and that's okay. It happens all the time. But using a synthesis matrix allows you to visually see what themes each source is or is not meeting and how to address those things. These are more than just summaries or evaluations or even analysis. It requires you to synthesize the source material as it relates to themes or a coding scheme. And we'll talk a bit more about what that means later on. Synthesis matrices are really useful for taking qualitative data, interpreting it, and then generating graphs or charts to statistically represent that data. So this is where we can utilize mixed methods approach here to take qualitative data from, say, like an ethnographic journal, see which themes it is or is not achieving, and then create a graph or a chart that you could represent later on via qualitative data representation. But before we get into themes and codes, one of the things I emphasized was that synthesis matrices require more than summary, more than analysis. They require synthesis. So let's talk about each of those individually, right? So first, let's talk about summary. What is a summary? How do we summarize? That sort of thing. A summary requires 3 different steps. First, you have to read the thing. Whatever the thing is, whatever the source is, you need to read it, and then you need to critically and methodically determine if the source is appropriate in context to your research question. So this is more than just scanning it. It's scanning it to see if it fits your research purposes. But then it's also making a critical decision of, is this attempting to answer my question or not? And that's a very important step when we get to summary. After you have read through a source and you have determined that the source is appropriate within the context of your research question, then you have to make sure that you comprehend what the source is saying. A lot of times what I find novice writers doing is that they will find a source, it seems like it meets their research goals, and then they accidentally misrepresent that source because they didn't comprehend what the source was actually trying to say. Happens all the time. But if you read the source, you need to evaluate what you understand from that source in order for it to be useful for you. And if you don't do that first, then what you are leading towards is accidental plagiarism. Even if you have the accurate citation information, if you are misrepresenting a source in a way that demonstrates you don't understand what that source is saying, that's plagiarizing in a way. And it also shows that maybe there was a little bit of planning in our process that could have been improved upon. So first, you need to read the source and determine if it fits your research question. Then you need to try and comprehend what that source is actually saying to really make sure that it's useful for you. After you've done both of those things, break the source down. What are the main ideas? What are some of the talking points? Can you identify a potential abstract concept? Like if we're looking at an article and we're looking at the article in abstract, what is that concept that might make it easier to communicate to all kinds of audiences? And then how can we explain what we understand? And that's the key thing here. It's not enough to read it and to comprehend it, but also how can we explain it? That is the meat and potatoes of what it is to provide a summary. Then we have analysis, right? Another term that we're very familiar with. And so I have broken it down because that's what analysis does. It takes a topic or issue and it breaks it down further. And a good way to think about analysis is that the whole makes the parts. So we start with the broad topic or issue. Then we break it down to maybe figuring out how it works, right? So here's the issue that we're having. How does it work? Or why does it work like that? So that allows us to get additional context and look for evidence to support why it does or how it does do that thing, whatever the topic may be. And then synthesis is kind of like a flippity flop, where it's actually parts that make the whole. So after we have summarized and after we have analyzed and we've gathered some evidence, how can we take our analysis, categorize that analysis by theme, like theme patterns or codes, and then bring them all together to provide insight or a perspective on a given issue or topic. So let's summarize all of it. We have summary, which demonstrates a basic understanding of the source. You're able to identify main ideas, maybe outline some points, and you may be even able to craft a thesis statement. But a summary tells us what it said. What is being said, that's summary. Then you have analysis, which breaks down a complex issue into smaller ideas to develop a deeper understanding of that topic. And it moves beyond summary, asks us how and why something may or may not be working, investigates, evaluates, and examines sources to gain new insights. With analysis, we move from what is a source saying to what does a source mean, right? And this is very key here. If we have already misrepresented our sources in a summary, then the analysis is going to be impacted by that. The type of analysis we're able to provide is already impacted. So that's why comprehending the source is key to summary before we can actually evaluate and examine what a source means. And then you have synthesis, which develops new cohesive arguments or perspectives. So we're moving beyond analysis, right? We have figured out exactly what a source is saying. We've analyzed what it means. And now we are interpreting, comparing, contrasting these sources and integrating them together to see how they are connected by theme. So summary tells us what a source is saying. Analysis is telling us what it means. And synthesis is how all of it connects together. But let's try it, right? That's a lot of information. So let's break it down. I'm going to go through all of these stages. I'm going to summarize, analyze, and synthesize a source based off of a research question live in front of you. All right, so if we are going with my research question that I have here on the screen, our first year writing program successfully increasing engagement when we rely on punitive attendance measures. You know, that's a yes or no question potentially, but it also invites more inquiry, which is the point of a research question. So I have a quote here from Angela Davis. about from her book, Are Prisons Obsolete? And I'm going to read the quote to you out loud. Feel free to follow along on the screen. To reiterate, rather than try to imagine one single alternative to the existing system of incarceration, we might envision an array of alternatives that will require radical transformations of many aspects of our society. Alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination will not, in the final analysis, lead to decarceration and will not advance the goal of abolition. So that's the quote. I have read it. I am going to work through comprehending it in the next slide, but I've also included a list of APA citations here. A narrative citation is when you have the author or the researcher's last name followed by the publication year. And I'll demonstrate how we could use a narrative citation in a paragraph. You have in-text citations, which again is the author or researcher's last name, publication year, and then a page number or a paragraph number if there's no page number available. Then you have your full citation, which would be Davis A.Y., publication year, Are Prisons Obsolete? 7 Stories Press, because this is from a book. Obviously, if you're doing academic journals, those are going to be formatted differently, but in this case, this is coming from a book. So let's work through how I can begin to comprehend what this quote is trying to say. So I have 2 different representations of this quote. I have taken the quote and I've sort of highlighted what I think the key ideas are in this quote here. So in yellow, I have tried to imagine one single alternative. In orange, the existing system of incarceration. In green, an array of alternatives that will require radical transformations of many aspects of our society. In blue, alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination. And then in pink, will not in the final analysis lead to decarceration and will not advance the goal of abolition. So these are what I thought the key ideas were. And I think the main argument of what, if I'm trying to understand what this quote is that to look at the existing system of incarceration and then demand that changes be made towards abolition. But how do I really know that? So I created this sort of visual representation of what each of these moving parts are. So if I'm looking at the existing system of incarceration, I've created a little orange house. That's the existing system of incarceration. And then I color coded it based off of how I'm beginning to understand each part of this quote. So if I'm looking at the blue section here, alternatives that fail to address racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination. I have here, to reiterate, infers that there are alternatives to our current system. I think I miscolor coded that. I think I wanted this one to be yellow. Try and imagine one single alternative. But similarly, in yellow, we require multiple alternatives to incarceration. In green, an array of alternatives that will require radical transformations of many aspects of our society. Alternatives must be radical and transformative. And then finally, I have here in pink, demands that Davis is demanding, demands that alternatives be inclusive and recuse tools of white supremacy. So it kind of summarizes this blue and pink section here, where racism, male dominance, homophobia, class bias, and other structures of domination are all tools under white supremacy culture. So that is a way that I paraphrased that, so that way I don't have to quote directly from Davis. And so this is just a way, and as you can see, like I even made some mistakes, right? This is for you, right? The way that you sort of break things down is not anything that your reader or even I have to see, but these are just some things that you can do to begin to understand and comprehend what a quote is actually trying to say, what a source is trying to say. No, I'm not saying that you have to make a diagram of entire articles, But if you find a quote that resonates with you and you want to really try and understand it, it might help to highlight it in different colors. It might help to create a visual diagram. There's a lot of different ways for us to begin to cognitively break something down in order to understand it. But how do we translate all of this into a summary, right? Into a written summary. So based on all of these ideas, I paraphrased Davis and I wrote a summary. So here's what I wrote. Davis, 2003, and there's my narrative citation there, asserts that in order for prisons to truly become obsolete in our current society, we have to imagine a world that radically transforms and challenges the existing systems that allow the current state of incarceration, of which prioritizing alternative methods of justice demands we decenter structures of white supremacy, and that the path to abolition is not predicated upon maintaining those structures that continue to oppress its people. And then I have my in-text citation here, Davis, 2003, page 108. What do we notice about this summary that I've written? There's no direct quotes. There is nothing wrong with using direct quotes. But if I was looking for a salad of direct quotes from a series of authors, I would go read those authors. But a summary is a great way for you to learn how to paraphrase ideas in order for you not to rely on the words of others. And the best way to learn how to do that is to break it down. Make sure that you understand it. Read it, make sure you understand it, and then explain what it is. And while there are some words in here that are borrowed, such as radically, existing system, incarceration, right? It's going to be very difficult not to utilize the same language when you're talking about the works of others. However, I also have a citation, so that way somebody reading it will know these are not my whole ideas. This is a summary of somebody else's work. And I wanted to show you guys that distinct difference. But let's move on to analysis, right? Now that I've summarized it, right, I'm telling and explaining people what Davis is saying. How do I break down this idea even further? How do I begin to analyze it? So to analyze this quote, we're looking at the broad topic of incarceration, right? Prison systems. And in order for me to understand incarceration and kind of what Davis is talking about, we have to evaluate the existing system, which she is critical of, versus transformative systems or alternatives, as she called them. I use the phrase transformative, but that's really what she's calling for, is radical transformation. So if I'm looking at existing systems, and everything that I know about existing systems based off of Davis is that the existing system is punitive and socially accepted, advocates as the only way forward to justice, but data demonstrates otherwise. Similarly, relies on oppressive structures to maintain, conditioned to believe this is the only method for justice. A lot of times when we think about prison systems, people anticipate punishment as the only way for justice. And Davis advocates for otherwise. And so in her evaluation of the existing system, the system that is punishable and socially accepted, this is what it relies on in order to function. But similarly, what she's also saying in her quote for more transformative justice is decentering white supremacy culture. So those are all the racism, the homophobias, the transphobias, fat phobias, etc. All the isms and the phobias are tools of white supremacy that help maintain the existing system. Historically, other methods of justice have existed that were transformative and actually held societies accountable. And I think this is an interesting thing, analysis-wise, that I could always add, is that accountability is not punishment. Accountability is a result of a series of choices made and being held to those choices, whereas punishment is punitive, right? We can still have accountability without prison systems. And that's sort of what Davis is getting to the heart of. Transformative justice allows for reduced recidivism, less incarceration, and greater social accountability without relying on oppressive structures to maintain dominance. And this is where I'm sort of pulling, I'm sort of fueling my analysis with others, like other sources that I've potentially read that are supporting each other, which would be useful in a synthesis matrix, but we're not quite there yet. So now that I've sort of broken down and begun to analyze what Davis actually means, I wrote it out. So my analysis is going to be in blue, and in yellow was my summary from before. So I'm going to reread my summary, and then I'm going to read my analysis. Davis, 2003, asserts that in order for prisons to truly become obsolete in our current society, we have to imagine a world that radically transforms and challenges the existing systems that allow the current state of incarceration, of which prioritizing alternative methods of justice demands we decenter structures of white supremacy, and that the path to abolition is not predicated upon maintaining the structures that continue to oppress its people. The existing system of incarceration is allowed to flourish because we have been conditioned as a society to accept punitive measures as an acceptable mode of justice. It is through this conditioning that we equate accountability with punishment. Meanwhile, those in favor of the existing system argue that the core of incarceration is to pay a debt to society and rehabilitate. Yet, recidivism rates are at an all-time high, and through the lens of white supremacy, there will still be people whose debt will remain unpaid. If the goal of incarceration is rehabilitation, there are far more transformative methods of rehabilitation that are beneficial, grammar, humanizing, and existed long before prisons. So you see how I took what Davis said, and now I'm beginning to try and figure out what Davis means. That's where we have analysis. So summary is telling the reader exactly what Davis said, whether it's through direct quotes or paraphrasing. And now I'm beginning to figure out what Davis means. Now let's synthesize all of this, right? Because now we have figured out what Davis is saying. We've begun to analyze it. And now we need to synthesize it in relation to a potential research question, right? And to remind you all, my research question was about first-year writing programs. And here I am talking about incarceration. So how I have these two ideas, incarceration versus attendance policies, right? Attendance policies, engagement, first-year writing programs. And how do those ideas connect, right? So here I have existing, oh, Lord have mercy. Oh, Lord have mercy. Okay. So here I have existing and transformative systems on the left-hand side, where punitive and socially acceptable advocates is the only way forward to justice, but data demonstrates otherwise, relies on oppressive structures to maintain, conditioned to believe this is the only method for justice. Similarly, with transformative systems, decenters white supremacy. Historically, other methods of justice have existed. Transformative justice allows for reduced recidivism, less incarceration. So I took my analysis from the previous diagram and I put it on the left-hand side. And now I have attendance policies in first-year writing programs, which are also punitive and socially accepted, relies on appeals to tradition, surveillance, and approaches pre-COVID, disregards disability, chronic illnesses, and other potential barriers to success, doesn't address engagement, puts emphasis on the workforce and rate of investment, return on investment, as a means to continue utilizing this metric. Data demonstrates that attendance doesn't equate to academic performance or engagement, devalues education over profit. So I'm beginning to take these two ideas and figuring out how they might come together. So if attendance policies are punitive and socially acceptable, but so is the current existing system of incarceration that we have, and attendance policies relies on this appeal tradition. This is how we've always done it. We use it as a tool for surveillance, and we've been using it. And this is the only way that we could really truly measure engagement. Well, so does the existing system of incarceration. It advocates for very similar concepts. This is the only way that we can provide justice. This is the only way that we can measure engagement. Relies on oppressive structures, disregards disability, chronic illnesses, and other barriers, relies on oppressive structures. So there is a connection between attendance policies in the current moment and the system of incarceration or prisons in the abstract. Transformative systems call for decentering these things, whereas transformative pedagogy in terms of attendance in first-year writing classes are noticing that the current system devalues education. So it devalues education, this devalues rehabilitation. So there's a lot of connecting tissues here. So how do I work through connecting those ideas? And I have it in green. So I'm not going to reread the summary and the analysis, right? You can reread the entire paragraph. Instead, I'm going to read the green section, which is my synthesis of all of this. Here it goes. If we consider Davis's framework in relation to attendance policies in first-year writing classrooms, we can begin to see how both prisons and school systems function under similar systems of oppression. Punitive measures of justice are considered the only way forward. Therefore, the only socially accepted method of justice is incarceration. Attendance policies are considered the tried and true method of gauging student academic performance as well as class engagement. Meanwhile, both disregard the barriers that such systems put in place that prevent access, success, and retention. Instead, attendance policies function as a tool that keep the system going, that maintain those system barriers without addressing the main issue. Is it actually working? By examining academic performance and engagement through a transformative lens, we can begin to understand what Davis is trying to get to the heart of, that radical transformation requires us to prioritize the human over the system. Until we do that, we cannot begin to envision a reality where accountability is justice, not punishment. So we were able to summarize, analyze, and synthesize one quote without actually directly quoting it. And this takes practice, right? Which is why I broke it down the way that I did. So when you are beginning to synthesize, if it's helpful for you to go through the different stages, first summarize, then analyze, then synthesize, great. But just know that with synthesis, you are doing more than just telling me what the source is saying. You are doing more than analyzing how the source works, but you're also connecting your ideas together, which will be useful in your synthesis matrix. Shameful plug. Okay. Now that we've talked about summary, analysis, and synthesis, now we're at the stage in our project where we are going to begin to interpret our data. And there's a lot of ways that you can do this too. These could include frameworks, perspectives, theories, methods of analysis. There is no limit to how you can begin to interpret your data. And the way you interpret that data will rely on a couple of different things. What your research question is, right? So if my research question is about attendance policies and engagement, I better frame it in that way, how I analyze or interpret my data. The design of your research study. So if you are using qualitative and quantitative methods, how are you collecting that data? And then in which order are you doing those things? So how you design your study also determines how you begin to interpret that data, and which do you interpret first, which do you interpret last. And then finally, your rhetorical goals as a researcher, your sense of exigence here, what your purpose is. All of those things impact the way that you interpret your data. One of the ways that you can interpret data is through something called thematic analysis. This is the most widely used method of analyzing qualitative data, but also quantitative data. You can use this alongside with theoretical frameworks and approaches, and it's suitable for inductive and deductive reasoning. So when we say inductive or deductive, it's the way that we can begin to understand what that data is trying to say. Inductive is how we might infer or how we might interpret what something is saying, whereas deductive is the objective thing, that the objective interpretation of that. Deductive reasoning could be definitions from a dictionary, whereas inductive is maybe looking at specific word choices and asking what the context of that word choice is in a given situation. It also allows you to see the gaps and the current ongoing conversations happening within the research. So there might be running themes that you notice in your research, but there also might be some things missing in relation to your research question, and that's okay. The important thing to know is that thematic analysis is recursive. It's not linear. It doesn't happen in order. You can start your thematic analysis one way, and then through your revision process, may need to revamp some things in a different way, and that's okay. It can kind of go more fluid. It doesn't have to be start to finish. There are 6 different phases of thematic analysis, and this little graph here on the left-hand side is the steps of thematic analysis as detailed in Braun and Clark. I pulled this straight from the article that I made you all read, and I thought it was useful. So let's break down the 6 different steps. 1, you need to familiarize yourself with the data. So after you have conducted your research, examine the raw data and know it. Know it like the back of your hand. You don't have to have it memorized, but you have to be so familiar with it that you can talk about it. Read it, reread it, look for patterns, understand it. Then you have number 2, generating initial codes. So when we say codes, these are labels or categories that might help you summarize your data. These can be just initial codes, and I'll talk more about coding schemes on the following slide, but these are just what some, after you have read and reread and you've looked for patterns, what are some initial codes, labels, or categories? Could we begin to fit our data into certain boxes? Number 3 is searching for themes. After you've sort of initially come up with your initial codes, look for themes in the research. What keeps popping up? What's being left out? 4, return to your data, review your potential themes, return to your data, and make sure your themes are representative of that data. So if you were initially looking at your data and you identified a theme, but after you have sort of been categorizing it and looking at the ongoing conversation, if you need to change your themes because it's not actually representing what the data says, that's fine. Revision happens constantly. Remember, it's recursive. It's happening constantly. It's not start to finish. It's not linear. 5, defining and naming themes. Refine your themes as you need to and define what those might mean. And a lot of times we can utilize a code to define something. If the thing that we're defining is the existing system of incarceration, then we can see how each of those sources is or is not defining what that might mean. And then finally, writing it up. Present your findings, make meaning of those findings, and connect the dots for your reader. That is your job as the researcher and the writer here. There is a lot of planning before you get to the point where you can present your findings in a way that is accessible depending on your audience. So let's talk a little bit more about coding schemes just in general, and then I will demonstrate how thematic analysis and coding schemes can look like in a synthesis matrix in the following video. So coding, as we refer to in the social sciences, is a specific analytical and methodical process that allows us to take raw data, and this can be qualitative or quantitative, and categorize it in order to help us develop meaning from that raw data. So putting it simply, coding schemes are categories or labels that we develop to organize the data to help us analyze it later. These codes can be keywords, they can be ideas, themes, definitions, they can be all sorts of things. And the point of the coding scheme is to be detailed enough to address your research question, but broad enough that you can categorize your data in all sorts of ways. And so in the demo, I will talk about thematic analysis. I'll talk about synthesis, and I'll talk about coding schemes as it's relevant to a synthesis matrix. And I will be utilizing the template that I created for you all. Feel free to use that. And I'm just going to walk you through how I have input that data, and then kind of go over ways that we can begin to understand a quote in order to try and see if it fits in those boxes. So thank you very much. Stay tuned for more.